the reason why I love this question is it's a question that will ultimately be on the minds of many, many property investors, which is the classic sell or hold question, right?
Sell or hold?
Now, there was a few clues in what we've heard. The first one is it's a studio apartment. Now, in the early 2000s, Bryce, I did a lot of research. So, when I was an enthusiastic amateur and sort of 10 years into my journey or thereabouts, I was starting to look at yield stories, right? I was starting to say, okay, I've got the growth stories. I want to have a look at how yield plays and what's the relationship between yield and capital growth and those type of things. And you could always clearly see that studio apartments had these extraordinarily higher yields compared to not only apartments, but also compared to houses. So I thought, why is that? Like, what's the driver here? Because ultimately, at the end of the day, income is helping me stay in the market, but I am looking for capital growth over the long term. Now, we've seen this property has been held for 20 odd years,
20
and
years,
it's produced a 1% compounding return,
less
and
than.
it's still negatively geared. That is telling me there's a lot of alarm bells ringing in terms of how I look at this particular property for Hahn, because it's not doing what I think it should do. So the conclusion of that deep research that I did led me to think about land to asset ratios, led me to think about productive use of property and how you produce, productive use of land, and obviously concepts around these sort of margin of safety type calls. And it was really, really clear that when I studied the performances of all the assets that I could find, that the growth rate underperformed the growth rate of apartments and units, and definitely underperformed the growth rate of houses. And so off the back of that, I'm thinking, well, okay, well, why would I then invest? Well, then it became the yield story, and the yields weren't strong enough to justify that, because we know the power of compounding returns, and we know the fact that over that time period, it's only moved from 315 to 380. So we have not seen any real growth in this asset. And what you'll also find with studio apartments is they are very much sold and valued similar to the way in which you might value commercial property, which is a multiple of yield, right? So they look at the yield and then they look at what sort of pricing they would get. And that's usually how commercial property values move up, is basically the rent that they can attract. So on the whole, in terms of 999 out of 1,000 purchases of studio apartments, I am avoid at all cost as a general rule. Okay, will not touch studio apartments off the back of that research that I did, and that's obviously kept me in very, very good stead in terms of the investing that I've done personally, but also the advice that we've given over the last 20 odd years in terms of helping other people in this particular space. So we've always stood clear of those types of things. So I don't know the overall personal circumstances for you, Han, so it's hard for me to give you specific direct advice, but there is a massive opportunity cost problem here. And that, for me, also, whilst it's negatively geared, says to me, are you going to wait out 15 years and hope that you're going to get some growth? Well, if that yield, to your point, is reduced through lack of future demand from student accommodation, it's also reduced in terms of ongoing holding costs and maybe even some land tax that might creep in there as well eventually. So if your yield is going to be sort of stifled by that, then where's the capital growth story going to come from? Where's the demand going to come from? Because as I close out my piece here, Bryce, I am thinking about sort of saying, who's the target audience? Who are the people that are going to want to buy a studio apartment in these particular markets? So usually it is students. Usually it is people looking for affordable accommodation in our inner city, in our big city areas, and that's not a very big cohort. So from that point of view, I don't have that larger cohort demand, and I've got all of these other problems which I've just outlined.
Yeah, and Ben, if you think about what Han is facing here, she's actually looking. If you extrapolate her question out, she's looking at a 30-year window, because she's
Yeah,
had it for 20, and wants to hold it for another 15. That's 35 years. If like we spend our whole professional life trying to get someone to hold a property for 30 years, Ben. So
yeah, a
my
decade.
if you're going to hold a property for 30 years, tick, well done. Second one, you've got to make sure you're holding the right one. So,
Yeah.
um, owner-occupier appeal is only everything when it comes to investing in property, right? So we're tapping into the great Australian dream cycle in this country, essential need, but also the willingness for people to use it as status and prestige and reinvest into it, and all of those things that come when property transcends more than just an essential need in a lucky country like what we've got now. So
Mm.
owner-occupier appeal for a studio apartment is very, very minuscule, if it even exists. So number one, first challenge here, Han. Number two is I always think, whenever you're thinking of a property and you're getting stuck, is this the right one? I mean, a haze of noise, all that sort of stuff. Just go, would the banks like it? Because if you're buying property in this country, you're usually needing banks assistance or some lending. Now, banks don't like small apartments. They particularly don't like anything under 50 square meters. So, first of all, we have no owner occupier appeal. We
Hmm.
also have a scenario where shop it around all the banks, and chances are 99.9 out of 100 are going to say we don't love it. So, all of a sudden, we've got a challenge.
And Han, just a final point. Why you probably haven't acted, it's very common in our human nature. So when we talk about behavioral economics and we talk about behavioral sciences and heuristics, this is a classic case of loss aversion. And what the research shows is that when we experience a loss 2 times greater than we experience a gain, so ultimately you're not ready to realize that loss. And so that's why a lot of us often hang on to things that aren't performing well or aren't delivering, waiting for that because we don't want to recognize that loss. And I think it's a good reminder for people to basically then get, and you have done, you've got second opinions, potentially professional opinions around that, where they are saying, look, I care for you, but this is not an emotional decision for me. This is just a mathematical decision based on probabilities of future success from a return point of view. And we're saying, broadly speaking, those returns aren't going to come and your money might be better invested elsewhere.